you very much. I'm embarrassed. It was the first time that I talked from a podium to an international assembly. So, good evening to all of you. I'm really honored to be here. Intimately, yes, there is this voice which keeps saying to me why I'm here, but David told you why I'm here. I'm a doctor, I'm a pediatrician. I'm not an historian, but I do like the history of my university, of my town. David actually saw me guided friends with a superficial knowledge about his history, and everything started from there. Before I start, I guess you all know those two guys. They were two famous comics. You all know them, I guess. They were famous also in England. In Italy, were very, very famous, of course, because they were what they were doing, but essentially because they were speaking Italian with a very funny English accent. So I guess you understand what is my feeling now, that I have to speak English with my funny Italian accent. And I please apologize for my pronunciation and for the possible mistakes I have left you through my slides. Briefly, a little tour to what I will be saying. Yes, I will have an incipit, of course, to start. I will briefly talk about the history of Padua and the university, but mostly I will be talking about the history of medicine in Padua. And then, of course, we will be finished. So if you're ready, I'm ready, we go. So that is the incipit. Act first, scene first, we are in Padua, a public place. Lucrezio enters and says, Tranio, who was his man, sins for the great desire I had to see fair Padua, nursery of arts. A few lines below, he continued and said, it is difficult things for me to pronounce, because I was in Pisa left and am to Padua come, as yet leaves a swallow plash to plunge him in the deep. With the society seeks to quench his thirst. Of course, I don't know the pronunciation. But I think you all admire Shakespeare, and I think you all agree that Shakespeare knew what he was saying, not only about the human psychology, the human being, but about the history that was living. And indeed, I think it is universally recognized that between the 16th and the 18th century, the University of Padua was really a nursery of arts, and it did play an extraordinary role in promoting biomedical science. The legends once that we, people from Padua, come from this region here, in the Paphlagonia area, and the legends say that we were fighting against the Greek in Troia, led by a man called Pilemone. When our ancestors were defeated, Antenore led this group of people here in the north of the Adriatic Sea, and in this area between the mountains and the gold, what is now Venice, and the sea, he actually gave birth to the ethnic of the Eneti and founded what is now Padua, a region which was famous for his horses. That's what is written in all the ancient books. It is legend, of course, but we do, even now, take things that Antenore was really our ancestor, our founder, despite in his grave, recently it has been shown there is a body of a soldier from the 16th century and not from that time. Anyhow, Padua appears in the written history in 302 when Tito Livio, one of the famous historians, who actually was Padua, was describing a fight between people coming from Sparta and people living there who were people from the city of Patavium. So we know that from the 3002 before Christ, that Padua actually existed with this name of Patavium. In 14 before Christ, we were actually part of the Roman Empire, and we were governed by Ius Romanum. And we rapidly grew, and the time of Strabone, who was one of famous Greek historian and geographer, Padua was considered one of the biggest city and one of the richest city in the Roman Empire. We were linked to Rome, and of course we shared the fate of Rome, and actually in the 602, we were completely destroyed by the barbarian, and Padua didn't exist anymore. Actually, what remained was the structure of what was the original Catholic Church which were starting to build at that time, We had actually a bishop in the 15th century, one of the first bishops in the land that we call now Italy. And around the structure of this primordial church, Padua started his resurrection at the turning of the millennium. We grew fast. We were close to main rivers. We were close to the river. With those rivers close to Padua, we could reach easily the sea. So we grew fast. And actually, on one point, in 1178 after Christ, it is said there were 16 parishes, 2,614 wood buildings, 300 towers, and almost 100,000 inhabitants. Those data were coming from, were censored at the time of the big fire. Bottom line, Padua was growing very fast, and at the turn of the 13th century was one of the most rapidly expanding demographic, economic, and cultural urbanistic entity in the Italian land. And that was such that on September 29th, 1222, St. Michael Days, the University of Padua was founded. And actually, it is granted as the second oldest Western university in the world, being the first, Bologna. Actually, nothing grew from nothing. At that time, there were already some ecclesiastic schools teaching theology or sacred canons, and some lay school and studying for liberal arts, for lawyers, notary, and most likely also for medical doctors. When we talk about university, of course, in 1222, we are not talking to something which is what we think it is in our university. It was a conceptual unit. It was not an organic unit. In other words, people at that time wanted to give legal status to corporate regulation to a series of single entities, which altogether made the Universitas Scholarium how it was originally called. The components of the university were the essential component, were of course the students, called universities. The College of Doctors were the ones supposed to administer the exam, and the Chancellor. Originally, the students were not organized according to what they were studying, were simply divided by geographic origin. So there were the Cismontanes, meaning essentially the Italians, and all the others, the Ultramontanes, in which each one of them had its own rector. Originally, there were the low students which dominated the show because of their seniority and because of their number. But sooner, other students, the ones who were studying medicine, philosophy, and literature, became more important, and they started to claim their independence. So 1 century after, a bit more, the University of Padua was founded. Actually, there were 2 universities. The Universitas Juristarum, which were the law student, and the Universitas Artistarum, which were all the others. And that remains for many years. The lecturer, the teacher, were at that time selected by the students. Well, there was an ancient privilege, which, however, were soon taken out from their hand because it was too important to appoint professor, as I guess it is still now. There were different kinds of lecturers. There were 2 kinds of lecturers, the ordinary and the extraordinary. But I want to mention to you that is, I think, an interesting finding. At that time, every ordinary lecturer had to have a competitor, an antagonist, lecturing in the same text. In other words, the students were free to go to hear or one lecturer or his antagonist. So there was a competition between them to improve the quality of their teaching. And actually, if you look at the history of Padua, only very few, you count them in 2 hands, famous teachers were granted with the privilege of reading without an antagonist. Otherwise, there was always an antagonist. Okay, well, there's briefly to say that in order to become a lawyer, you have to study 6 years. In order to be a liberal arts, 5 years, and to study medicine, at least 3 years. In order to attain a doctorate, you have to do 2 examinations, helped by promoters. One was handled privately, and one at the cathedral. Because at that time, as I will be saying, it was the Pope, and actually the bishop, his delegate, to give the doctorate. And the end, in the public cathedral, there was given to the student a symbolic book a doctor caps, a gold ring, and then a big embrace and the benediction that allow him to be really a professor. Very briefly, then I will enter into the history of medicine. There were 3 sacred colleges, called sacred because at that time it was actually the Pope, better, his delegate, the bishop, who granted the graduation. So there was the Sacred College of law students, of medicine, and of course, of the theology. As I said, the university had been, since the 1399, 2 university actually. We became a real modern university at the end of the 15th century, when in this building, actually all the rooms were law and medicine, all the other were put together in this palace, which is otherwise called the Palace of Bow, because at that time there was actually a sort of a hotel with the head of a cow, and the word bow means the cow. And since then, we have become the University of Padua that we know now. And this is part of the pictures, this is the outside part of the university, what looks like the beautiful Renaissance courtyard and some of the rooms inside the university. Let's now enter into the history of medicine. The history of medicine is just a long list of medieval and Renaissance, unquestionably people who can be called real scientists. And of course, is a long list of medical tests. And I will use this list to describe with you the history of Padua. More than anything else, you have to think of the history of medicine as a progress of knowledge made possible by a progressive refinement of the art of human dissection. There was no molecular biology. Our century is marked by the progress generated by the world of what we call molecular biology. On those centuries, the knowledge developed through the further refinement of the technique of human dissection. Let's start with the very beginning. A list of names. I just want to mention those 2 names. One is Pietro d'Abano. Pietro d'Abano was a teacher who actually had traveled. He studied in Constantinople, Istanbul. He taught Constantinople, he taught in Paris. He was a teacher of medicine, of philosophy, of mathematics, and of astrology. He's credited as the one who did the first autopsy. He was the one who actually made Padua famous. The thing that I want to show here is when we think to a medical professor, we have to think to someone totally different from what we think now a medical professor. He is a man who was knowledgeable in many human areas. He was teaching philosophy, mathematics. Medicine didn't have that specific profile that he has today. The other funny things about Pietro d'Abano, we are talking about the 13th century. He was highly persecuted by the church because he was firmly convinced that the knowledge, and please, I hope you understand what I mean, doesn't come from the word of the Pope, but come from what the scientist discovers. The simple concept, insofar as the organic things as concerned, was such a sort of an heresy for that time that he was persecuted, put in jail, killed, and 20 years after he was killed and buried, they took out his bones, they burned the bones, and they spread out in the land. They were very upset with him. The other man, Giacomo d'Ondi, I don't want to talk about him. Yes, he's famous because he wrote 2 important books. But once again, to give a sense that what we called at that time professor of medicine were actually men with a very broad culture. And in fact, Giacomo d'Ondi is not famous for the books that he wrote, medical book, but these beautiful mechanic clock, that you can still see today in Padua if you walk through the city. Just to give you the sense of what was going on in Padua at that time, where culture was growing up, at least there were 2 important figures which were passing by. One, of course, is Giotto da Bondone. Giotto da Bondone, of course, was a famous painter from the 13th century, who made these, among many things, he made this beautiful fresco in a chapel which is still visible now, which is called the Scroveni Chapels. I don't want to make jokes, but Giotto was a revolutionary paintings. Yes, I'm not going all straight. Sometimes I go by side, okay? Giotto was a revolutionary because for the first time, he made the sky blue. No, you are surprised, but that's absolutely true, because at that time the tradition was the Byzantine painting, and the Byzantine painting made the sky gold, because that was the God's house, and it could be just gold. And Giorgio said, why don't we do blue? And he did blue. The other fantastic things I want to mention, Giorgio, of course, he was the guy who made the people that the Byzantine was painting, which is standing like this, slightly turned. If you come to Ravenna, you see the beautiful puzzle, not puzzle, there are no paintings, mosaics. You see all the people standing. But finally, Giotto freed them, and you see, and they allow them to express their feeling. Finally, the human life come into the paintings, and those are the main contributions Giotto made. And just to give a sense of what was boiling in Padua at that time. Also Dante was passing by the way. He has his daughter who died in Padua, and apparently between Pietro d'Abano, Dondi dell'Orologio, Giotto and Dante Alighieri, there were a lot of chatting among themselves. Just to stay once again a little on side, we just have had St. Anthony in Padua. And the thing that I want to mention to you, because that's probably not known, for us, the Catholic, St. Anthony is a very famous saint. Just to give you a sense, we have a number of pilgrims in Padua to see the St. Anthony Church, which is as big as the number of pilgrims we go to Lourdes. Just to give a sense how much is honored. Well, the thing that is not known about at least the thing that is not generally known about St. Anthony, how good he was, blah, 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 that first of all, he was the first Franciscan who was allowed to study, because San Francisco, when he started his order, the miners, didn't allow them to study. But St. Antonio was such a smart man that San Francisco recognized that he couldn't allow him not to study. And he was so famous for his knowledge, for his talk, that as of today, in these little things, there is his tongue that we still go to honor it, the tongue of St. Anthony. Anyhow, just to say, but whatever, what I want to say that St. Anthony actually was specifically called by the Franciscan order to Padua to control over university which was growing. They were too upset, too concerned that after Pietro Abano, they were growing heresies. So they wanted a smart man to look after university. Okay, let's move to the next century. The next century, there were the teaching of medicine was clustering in three groups: the theoretical medicine, practical medicine, and surgery. What was theoretical medicine? Theoretical medicine was the summary of what at that time was known about medicine. Bottom line was a tradition coming essentially from the Eastern world, from the work done by Avicella and by Galeno. And actually, those were the teachers, and actually the collection of their thoughts was actually put together what is called the Fasciculus Medicinae. At that time, the students were referring to those books. What was in that books? Some example. They were talking about laboratory medicine, urine analysis. Those are pictures taken by those books. This is a student showing to the professor, whatever, what is visible to all of you. And of course, then there was tests explain about how the colors of the urine can help to make the final diagnosis. They were dealing with the main disease. Those are pictures taken by those from the Fascicolo de Medicina. They were talking about the venous for doing phlebotomies that at that time was one of the major therapeutic procedures. They were talking about the astrology. They were still thinking that astrology, like we still believe now, for some extent, have an influence on the human character and disease. We're talking about wounds, and of course, we were talking about the woman's matrix. It's funny because it's not readable here, but here is written as it is. Disease a woman as it is. Of course, those are fascinating pictures for that time. Then the other part of the teaching of medicine was practical medicine. Pretty much were commentary. They were commenting, they were discussing about clinical cases which were already illustrated, already presented by the book coming from the Arabia, in particular from Avicella and Rhasis. And finally, there was surgery. Surgery was, during the 3 years of the study of medicine for surgery, that was divided, but it's not important to say. But the surgeon was the one who was also expected to do the dissection. And indeed, at the middle of the half of 14th century, the practice of dissecting body was well established and was preparing actually the revolution who followed very soon. There were 3 protagonists at that time. They give you the sense how was the approach. There was the lecture. The lecture had the book from Avicella, from Galeno, and was a sort of an extraordinary professor, one very good, was reading the book and tell what was going to be seen. Then there were the ostensor, an ordinary professor, just one level below, who was explaining to the students how things actually were according to what he taught. And finally, there were the sectors who were cutting the body. So the knowledge did not derive from the observation. The knowledge were coming from the book, from what the lecturer was reading. Before moving on the art of dissection, I move 1 second aside to mention one name, Paolo Bagellardo, funny name. However, he's one of the first books ever written about pediatrics. He is Opusculum de Agritudinibus and Remedis Infantium. At least this book is marked one of the first books about pediatric diseases. Let me go back to the university, and we move to the 16th century. And the 16th century witnessed a revolution in the concept of doing dissection. And the protagonist of the history of medicine in Padua in the 16th century is Andreas Vesalius. Andreas was a student from Brussels. He actually came to study in Padua. He graduated in Padua. And he wrote a fundamental book, De Humani Corporis Fabrica. I will enter. But in his name, the 2 era of medicine are signed, the medieval part and the modern part. What was his contribution? He thinks that the knowledge could not come from what Avicella or Galeno, the other, had written, but he thought that the knowledge could come from what the people were actually looking at. So he thought the anatomical research was a means for obtaining knowledge of those essential elements which make up the human body. And, stop. So what did Vesalius, what was the revolution? He threw away the text of Galeno of Avicella, of the Arabic medicine. He left them behind. He gets up from his chair. He was an extraordinary professor, picks up the knife, goes down, and he starts to himself to dissect the body. And in the middle of the circle. I mean, this scene has to be read as a radical change in mentality. Knowledge comes from what you actually are able to see. So anatomy is no more longer deduced from the text of the Arabic medicine, but the knowledge of medicine comes from what you actually observe during the dissection. And actually the scene comes. This is the book that he wrote, De Humani Corporis. This is Vesalius. You see, there are no more people around, only one protagonist. The lector doesn't exist anymore. The ostensor doesn't exist. The sector doesn't exist. Vesalius does all the job. And of course, what is the Humani Corporis? I mean, he didn't do any special observation, but he revolutionized the concept, and the Humani Corporis. At that time in Padua, there was also Niccolò Copernicus. Another one was starting to say, listen, guy, we cannot think about the universe according to what the religion said. Well, we need to start looking at the universe, what it looks like. So the revolution at that time was, of course, throughout the art of that time. Anyhow, let me just briefly say that Andrea Vesalius, in his work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica, put together almost 6 years of intense activity devoted to research and teaching on human dissection, and he made up this beautiful picture that you can see. These are part of the body showing the muscles. Here are the nerves and the bones, the brains. Outstanding picture of the brains. Of course, they couldn't have fixation to study the brains at that time. The skeleton, the internal part. For the first time, they were actually looking and repeating what they were doing. Stepping one side aside, of course, you have understand that the art had a lot of influence in this painting. Look, this is the body of a human lady that Vesalio made, of course. The inspiration from the antique Greek statues is much more evident than anything else. And the same when he started to describe the viscera of the man, he built a body which, of course, recalled other statues from the past century. But vice versa, however, his painting influenced the art. This is the picture depicting the skin. And look, this is Michelangelo in Rome, and sorry, block on the name. And here you see how probably Michelangelo took inspiration from the work of Vesalius. But not only that. Here, if you look at two masterpieces, one for Donatello, this is a scene in the Church of St. Anthony. This construction, which called the Miracle of Man, who actually was very stingy. Is it the right word? Someone that who doesn't want to give money to the others? Stingy? Is he okay? The miracle said that he did the dissection, didn't find the heart, but then they go to the box where he was keeping the money and he found the heart there. This is a miracle. But what I want to say, that this scene is clearly comes out from the work that Vesalio was doing. And similarly, if you go to this masterpiece of Mantegna, it's one of the first time that the dead body, in this sense, the Christ body, is seen from below. You see, clearly, the influence, we think, some critics say that the influence of Vesalius on the art was tremendous at that time. Okay. Vesalio fundamentally reached the conclusion that Galeno was wrong, and he was cheating, because all his painting that he was doing, all the drawing, were coming actually from dissection of animals and not a human being. I think he has some rights about it. Let me briefly now go on with some names. Geraldo Colombo, outstanding person, who was the first one who said that through the pulmonary arch there is no air, but there is blood. He was the first one who described the pulmonary circulation, or at least the fact that the lungs were irradiated by blood. Gabriele Falloppio was the initiator of modern, sorry for the mistake, embryology, and of course also for studying the human's reproductive organs. But probably one of the most outstanding names is Fabrizio d'Acquapendente. Why is famous, this guy? Well, he's famous, first of all, once again, for his beautiful paintings that he did and pictures that he did. They were actually colored and still are. That's how you can see them today. Beautiful pictures. Of course, this is coming out from a dissection of the monkeys. This is the bones. Look how real they are. Look how well they are done. We are talking about between the 16th and the 17th century. This is the hands with the muscle and the nerves. Piece of art. Of course, we are on a medical field. Of course, they can be ugly, but on the other hand, look how precise are those paintings, color painted they've made. This is the brains, the veins of a foot, the eyes. But what Fabrizio d'Acquapendente was famous because he prompted the construction of the anatomical theater. At that time, the dissections were made in any room they could. There was no specific place. But Fabrizio d'Acquapendente wanted to have a stable place where to do the human dissection. And he actually, thanks to in architecture, he built or inspired the building of the beautiful anatomical theater that you can still see now. It's a sort of inverted conus. The things that you have to imagine, picture, I didn't have a picture to show you. The space here is not made for people to sit. It's made for people to stand up. He wanted to have a very steep corner in order to allow even the people staying here up to be able to see well. But the fascinating thing is that that room didn't have windows. All the people were standing up with the torches lighted up. You can picture what was going on in those days, in the dark, with the human dissection. Of course, a bit cruel, but those were really scientists, no matter what. I like to mention that exactly at the same time, a new a new chair was opened, was the chair of Lecturam Simplicium. Bottom line, the professor, Francesco Bonafede, was the first one who had the lecture, was actually the initiation of modern pharmacy. He wanted to have a botanic garden where it could grow all the plants from which the medicine were derived at that time. And actually, that was the bona fide idea, to have a place in Padua where medical plants could be grown. And we should have a next also a modern pharmacy, how, in other words, how to extract those elements for the plants. And it's a beautiful garden, and it still can be seen today. Very briefly, moving to the next step, I want to mention a couple of names. Girolamo Fracastoro of Verona. He was a doctor, but actually he wrote a poem, one of the most famous Renaissance poems in, at least in Italy. It's called Syphilis sive morbo gallicus. Bottom line, he described the syphilitis at that time. And actually the name of syphilitis comes from the shepherd of this poem, just to mention this as a curiosity. And also he's the first one that described the problem of contagious, a possibility of spreading disease from one man to another. And finally, I want to mention another name, which is Girolamo Mercuriale, who, other than being the author of one of the books, which is thought to be the precursor of modern physical therapy, he wrote the oldest book on breastfeeding, and also a very famous text on the morbis puerorum, means in the disease in children. At that time, if you look at history of Padua, then the name of Marco Oddi appears. He didn't do anything special, this guy, but for the first time it is written that he brought students along the clinical world to show them exactly the sick. Little things, but you see, what we do now has long-lasting roots. Those are paintings from the Girolamo Mercuriale book. And then we enter in the real 17th century. What happened in Padua at that time? At that time, we had Galileo Galilei, was coming from Pisa, professor in mathematics in Padua for 8 years, and I think we all credit him as the one who introduced the concept of modern science, stating that the fundamental procedure to increase our knowledge is to measure things and to prove the measurements. And there is this beautiful saying that he actually wrote in his book, and I want to read with you. Nature, he wrote, is an enormous book which is continually open in front of our eyes. But it cannot be understood if we don't first learn his language and recognize the characters in which it's written. And it is written in mathematic language, and these characters are triangles, circles. Without these, we are simply wandering in vain through an obscure labyrinth. So he introduced the concept of a scientific approach to what we were doing. So a new medicine started, which was so-called the experimental medicine, where people were trying to develop tools to instrument the function of the body. And of course, we ran into funny things, like the pulsilogio. The pulsilogio was an instrument with which this guy, Santorio di Campodistria, was measuring the pulse of the vein. And actually, this is a funny balance with which he measured his body constantly through days by days, and finally he saw that his body weight was actually changed regularly. And he developed the concept of imperceptible transpiration, is understandable. He also developed a primordial. But the key person at that time was William Harvey, of course one of you, who actually came to study in Padua. He studied in Padua, he was graduated in 1602. And he is the one who actually demonstrated the circulation of blood, which by far is recognized as the most important event in the entire history of physiology. How he did that, he simply was measuring the volume of blood that he estimated was passing through the vein of the arms, just pushing one vein, one of the others, and he was made a calculation. So what I want to point it out, that Harvey arrived at the discovery of the circulation of blood by taking the problem not from a statistical mathematical models. He really estimated the volume, and he said it could not be that the mass of blood which passed through the heart or a large vessel in the unit of time is so great that it must be the periodical return of the same substance. I mean, it was a sort of mathematical concept that brought to say we do have the blood circulation. And actually, William Harvey is the man who contributed more to make Padua the famous as it was. The other names I will briefly mention: Adrian van den Spiegel, famous for describing the anatomy of the liver; Johann Walsing, who for the first time described the Kiefer's vessel; Wilson, and other many doctors. Let's go almost to the end of my lecture, entry in the 18th century. A new revolution came in the 18th century, and the name who made the revolution is Giambattista Morgagni da Forlì, who wrote this famous book. I read with you the title, De Sedibus et Causis Barbarum per Anatoma Indagatis. What did he do? For the first time, he tried to link the anatomical findings with the disease. He took them separated. First, he studied the anatomical findings, and then he considered the clinical symptom, and then he established and tried to establish a link. Simple things. No one before him have done it, and he was the first one to do that, and opening a new area. There was a sort of epistemological revolution, because after him, medicine was not taught about symptoms, but he started to be described and taught as a disease, as an entity where two symptoms are correlated anatomical findings. He wrote this fantastic book. Just to give you the sense, his book is made of an index of 78 pages with cross-reference between illness and symptom and pathological findings, and absolutely a masterpiece. The thing that he documents are many. Of course, I guess he was the first one to describe the syndrome that has been called the Morgagni-Adams-Stokes syndrome. He described for the first time the cirrhosis of the liver and various types of aneurysm, the gastric ulcer, the lumbar pneumonia, and many other things that you may be interested, particularly if you read that book. There are all the list of them. So I think that it's universally recognized that Giovanni Battista Morgagni da Forlì was the founder of what we call now the organ pathology. Other people followed, and I will just mention the name. Leopoldo Marcantonio Caldani was known as the founder of neurophysiology. Luigi Calza was the one who established the school of obstetrics, and other names. Briefly, some paintings, I put them because they were surprising for me. Those are the books coming from the work that Luigi Calza doing, show how they were doing the gynecologic examination at that time. But on the other hand, there are beautiful paintings showing the delivery of the baby. Those are fantastic pictures that you can see. And once again, some of the other paintings from those people. From the 19th century on, the history of medicine, at least in Padua, let us say, become the modern history. And the one of medical school in Padua is not more that unique to be taught as such. So in this sense, I think I should stop here, but remember that looking at the past, really the history of medical school in Padua, history of passion, of knowledge, of dedication, of scientists, no matter what, really scientists who were passionate about what they were doing, what they were discovering. The history of Padua now will be collected in a museum, which will be open in 2012. I am part of the commission who is dealing with the museum for the pediatric part, and I can only tell you that I will invite you to come to see what I just say, and eventually to admire the museum that will be open. Thank you for your attention.
Giorgio, don't go. We have, I hope, an opportunity for people to discuss all the things you've talked about today, and I don't know whether anybody would like to ask any questions of Giorgio.
Or make comments, I don't know.
Make comments.
Have we got some microphones? Just so people use the microphones when they talk.
Giorgio, thank you for that. That's fantastic. Thank you for that. That's fantastic. What remains of the dissecting theatre now that we, that image that we all know and understand? Is there anything left of that original theatre?
Well, the original, sorry, I'll put the lights on. Okay. The anatomical theatre is still there, as it is. It has been actually recently restored. Where is it? It has been recently restored, and And it is, sorry, gosh, here it is. Okay, it has been recently restored. This is a picture that I took a few days ago, and it's still visible. Of course, you cannot actually walk in, but you can see, you can go up and see. So that has remained. And most of these books, the picture that I show, are still there. They are actually at the moment collected part in Padua and part in a museum in Venice, and it will be transferred to the new museum in Padua. So no, those things are still there, still visible, still touchable. So the legend actually. So at that time, you need to know, if I can add a little thing. I want to make the talk too heavy. You need to know the human dissection. I mean, the church didn't like too much the human dissection because, of course, you couldn't violate the human bodies, except, however, if they were not Catholic, maybe Jewish, no matter what, that is true. Of course, if they were condemned to death, at that point, what is the difference? I'm joking a bit, but, those kind of things were possible. And actually, to be very honest with you, one of the things that is behind the scene, I couldn't say everything, is that the golden era of Padua were under the Republic of Venice. The Venetians were dealers, were dealers? No,
Yes,
merchants. And they were actually open to the East because most of the business was done with the East. So, of course, they were Catholic. But not that much. In other words, the flavor in Padua was free. I mean, it's funny, but the reason why Vesalio came to Padua because bodies were available. There was a good tissue bank there. At that time that was the flavor. That, the flavor was kind of more lay. It was not that, the influence of the Pope was there, but not that heavy. Because Venetian had already braved the area coming from the East, they've already seen that the world is not just Italy and the Catholic world, but was something much more and much bigger and much wider. So, anyhow, that was.
When did the medical school? Oh, thank you. When did the medical school first accept women?
Okay. Okay. No. Okay, women were not allowed. But I don't have the picture here. I don't have the picture, but I have the answer, however. Okay, and I tell you a funny story. Can I tell you a funny story, guys? Can I tell you 3 minutes? No, 4 minutes. Okay, the University of Padua, and there was actually a study recognized, is the first Western university who graduated a lady, who gave the graduation to lady. His name is Elena Lucrezia Cornario Piscopia. It was October 28, 1628. And for the first time in human history, it's written that in the Western world, a lady was graduating in Padua. And that is story. That is absolutely history. A commission was set up 10 years ago who came up with a large publication which said that the story is true. No matter what, it is. We think it is true. There is a statue of Elena Lucrezia Cornario Piscopia. And so just to say that, of course, women were not allowed. We're not allowed to study. And the first lady which appears in the list of students is in 1628 when Lucrezia Cornaro Piscopia was graduate. What is the story? Can I tell you the story? I tell you the story. The story is that Lucrezia Cornaro, it's not a chance that Elena was graduate. First of all, because it was coming from the richest family in Venice at that time. So anyhow, apparently, according to the biography, she was a terribly smart lady, speaking 8 languages at that time. I don't know which were, but she was speaking Greek, Latin, Spanish, whatever. And so she was absolutely an outstanding lady, of course. And so in 1627, she was ready to be graduate, and she said, right, we're ready. There was a lot of discussion, and in the books it's written there was a lot of donation to the church. Someone has said corruption. But no, it was donation to the church. But someone said maybe there was donation. Anyhow, they went to the Pope and said, okay, we have this lady, she wants to I make the joke, okay? Can I make the joke? But it's story. They say she wants to graduate in theology. The bishop have a fit. No, because, okay, a lady, okay, language, but in theology, which is the top of the science, is now possible. And he didn't allow it, despite the donation. So the Venetian went back. They were dealers, so they were excellent. And few months after, and it became, no, like 1 year after actually, they came up with an excellent idea. They were a bit more of donation because in the meantime the painting of the church they should destroy, so they had to do some bit more donation. But came up with an excellent idea. Nothing changed. No a single comma. Nothing. But they changed the subject. Let's make graduate in philosophy. Just say so. The bishop was happy, everybody was happy, and that was happened. That with the same book, with the same test, they just decided, let's make philosophy instead of theology. A bit more of donation, and the joke is done. This is history in Lucrezia Cornaro Piscopia's story. It's absolutely true, I guess. I mean, that was written in the book, with some word that I didn't use, like just donation. Lucrezia Cornaro Piscopia never married. She became a monk, a female monk. Nun. She died of tuberculosis very early in his life.
I think I'm going to suggest that Giorgio's covered such a wide-ranging topic. I think some of you might like to come down and talk to him personally rather than ask questions in front of the
In front of a glass of wine, maybe.
And a glass of wine. And one of the things we've suggested tonight, that David made this appeal, and Giorgio's brought these books which contain a lot of the pictures and information that he's presented to you tonight. And if you'd like to buy one of these books, or at least make a donation in return from it for a book, then if you make a donation in excess of £10, I'm sure you could leave with the book in your hand. And if you'd like to come down and look at the books and talk to Giorgio informally, that'd be very nice. It leaves me with the challenging task of how you say thank you to somebody who's just revealed several centuries of detailed medical development with such fluency, with such interest and enthusiasm, and with such authority. But I think I can say that you've done it in a truly remarkable way, Giorgio. Thank you very much.
Well, it has been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Okay, it has been my pleasure. Come on. Really my pleasure.